In 2023, I temporarily moved into a small cabin that I was subletting for a couple of months. At the time, my dad and I weren't getting along, and I needed somewhere else to stay for a while. The actual tenant of the cabin was dealing with some personal problems and had to leave, so he allowed me to stay there and pay the rent month to month. For simplicity, I'll just call him my landlord. The cabin itself was a small 2-level unit. Downstairs there was a tiny kitchen and a modest living room, while the bedroom was upstairs. To get to the bedroom, you had to climb a short staircase and open a strange hatch-style door built into the floor. It felt a little unusual, but the place worked for my temporary situation. The cabin was located at the very end of a dirt road with only a few other similar cabins nearby. One of them seemed empty because I never saw lights or cars there. The others clearly had people living in them. Although I had never actually met any of the neighbors, I often worked 12-hour shifts, so when I got home I was usually exhausted. Most nights I would just eat something simple and go straight to bed while watching TV. One night was exactly like that. I got home late, made myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich along with a protein shake, and went upstairs to the bedroom. Every night I made sure to close the hatch door in the floor. Sleeping with an open entrance to the bedroom always made me feel exposed and uneasy. Unfortunately, that door didn't have a lock since the cabin was really meant for just one person or couple. While lying in bed watching TV, I suddenly heard a voice coming from downstairs. "Who's up there?" The moment I heard it, my heart felt like it stopped. I immediately sat up straight in bed. The voice sounded like it came from inside the house, though for a moment I wondered if it could have been someone outside. I quickly grabbed a remote and turned off the TV. Slowly, I crawled toward the small round window above the bed and looked outside. It was extremely dark, and I couldn't see anyone. Trying to stay calm, I called out, "Who's there?" The silence that followed was overwhelming. After a few seconds, I carefully walked over to the hatch door, lifted it open, and looked down the stairs. I even called my dad's name, thinking maybe he had somehow come by to check on me. No response. Gathering some courage, I walked downstairs. I was honestly terrified, but I reached for the first light switch I saw. The living room lit up just like normal. In the back of my mind, I felt like no one was actually there, and I started convincing myself that maybe the voice had come from outside. I turned on the porch light and looked out the windows, scanning the dark road. There was nobody outside. Now I was mostly confused. I switched off the living room light and went back upstairs, closing the hatch door again. Since I was wide awake by then, I turned the TV back on. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard loud pounding on the bedroom door from below. The banging sounded aggressive, almost like whoever was down there was trying to scare me. At that moment, any doubt I had disappeared. Someone was definitely inside the house. This time I didn't turn the TV off. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. I was too scared to move. The worst part was knowing that the hatch door didn't have a lock. Whoever was downstairs could easily open it. I stayed frozen in bed for about 20 minutes. Eventually, when I felt brave enough to move, I started looking for my phone so I could call for help. Of course, it wasn't on the nightstand. I searched around the bed but couldn't find it. Then it hit me. I might have left it downstairs earlier. Reluctantly, I lifted the hatch door and looked down the staircase. The flickering light from the TV behind me let me see just a little bit into the living room. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, instead of turning on any lights, I ran straight out the back door barefoot. I sprinted to the nearest cabin where I knew someone lived because I had seen their lights on before. I knocked on their door again and again. After a moment, I noticed someone standing at the window beside the door, staring at me. I had no idea how long they had been watching. I shouted through the glass, explaining that I was their neighbor and that someone was inside my house. I begged them to let me use a phone to call the police. He definitely heard me, but he didn't say a word. He just kept staring at me through the window. It was deeply unsettling. Slowly, I started backing away from the door as I realized he wasn't going to respond at all. The way he just watched me in silence felt incredibly creepy. Then another thought crossed my mind. What if he had something to do with it? I looked down the dirt road, hoping to see lights from another house, but everything else was dark. With no other option, I ran back to my cabin through the back door. It was still closed exactly the way I had left it. I went inside, locked the door, and turned on every light in the tiny house. Then I began searching the entire place, not only for my phone, but also for whoever might have been inside. Eventually, I found my phone in my car after suddenly thinking to check there. Earlier that night, I had been so exhausted that I left it in the center console. When I returned to the cabin, the TV was still playing upstairs in the bedroom. I slowly walked up the stairs. The moment I reached the top, I froze. There was someone sitting on my bed, quietly watching the TV. It was a man. I let out a scream. He slowly turned his head toward me. Before I could even get a clear look at his face, I spun around and ran back down the stairs as fast as I could. I rushed outside, grabbed my phone, and immediately called 911. I locked myself inside my car while staying on the phone with the operator. From the car, I kept watching the house. After a moment, I noticed someone walking behind the house, heading toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I told the operator exactly what I saw. A police car arrived shortly after. One of the officers went inside the house and even checked the upstairs bedroom. After I explained that the man I saw had likely escaped into the woods, the officer asked if I had somewhere else I could stay for the night. Swallowing my pride, I ended up going back to my dad's house after quickly packing a few important things. The next day I returned to the cabin, stayed one more night, and then gathered the rest of my belongings. Luckily, the landlord agreed to return part of my rent. He asked me what the man looked like. After I answered, he didn't ask another question. That felt strange to me. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. From the neighbor who ignored me when I asked for help, to the landlord suddenly needing to leave the place earlier, and then someone somehow getting inside the cabin. Maybe everything was connected, or maybe I was just overthinking it. It was around 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night back in 2013. I was walking home from work along a poorly lit street. My car had been in the repair shop, so for a few days I had to walk nearly 3 miles home every night. The walk usually took less than an hour, so I was always home before midnight. I lived in a small town in southern Indiana. After about 10 p.m., the roads are almost completely empty. The only vehicles you usually see are truck drivers passing through on their way to Indianapolis. About a mile into my walk, I turned onto one of the dirt roads that eventually leads to my house. My home sits a little far from the main road, surrounded by forest, so you have to follow several dirt roads to get there. As I turned onto the road, I heard the faint sound of an engine somewhere in the distance. The noise slowly grew louder. Looking back, I noticed a van far down the road I had just turned from. It was moving slowly, and strangely, it didn't have its headlights on. At first, I didn't think too much about it. There was a cheap used car dealership in town that often sold vehicles with broken parts, including damaged headlights. I assumed the van probably belonged to one of their customers, so I kept walking. A few seconds later, the quiet night was broken by the loud revving of the van's engine. It suddenly accelerated, and its headlights switched on. The sudden noise startled me, but I still wasn't too concerned. That changed when the van got closer to the intersection. About 500 feet before reaching the dirt road where I was walking, the van suddenly turned its lights off again and slowed down. Now I was officially uneasy. Trying not to look nervous, I simply increased my walking pace. I kept glancing back every few seconds to make sure the van wasn't following me. Then my fears became real. I saw the van turn onto the same dirt road behind me. At that moment, I was only about 500 feet away from it. I started walking much faster. I didn't want to keep looking back, but curiosity and fear made me turn around again. What I saw sent chills through my entire body. The van had stopped. Both the driver's door and passenger door were open. That's when I ran. I sprinted down the road as fast as I could. While running, I heard what sounded like a gunshot somewhere not too far away. In that moment, I honestly thought I might not survive. I quickly turned off the road and ran into the forest, hiding behind a large rock. My heart was pounding as I tried to stay completely silent. Not long after, I heard a man's voice somewhere nearby. I think she went into the woods. Then I heard something even more disturbing. 3 young female voices answered him, and one of them said, "Okay, sir, we'll see if we can find her." At that moment, my fear changed into something even worse. I wasn't just scared of dying anymore. I was terrified that I might be dragged into whatever disturbing group this was. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. Then I heard the man say something that still haunts me. "Whoever finds her tonight doesn't have to drink the blood." My mind started racing. Was this some kind of cult? Were those girls kidnapped? Was I about to become their next victim? I stayed hidden behind that rock for what felt like forever, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Finally, I heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. I stayed hidden for a little longer, just to be safe. When I finally peeked out from behind the rock, I saw flashing red and blue lights just outside the forest. I ran out screaming for help. The officers rushed toward me and asked, "Do you know anything about this body?" Confused, I asked, "What body?" Then I saw it. In front of the police car was one of the most horrifying sights I have ever witnessed. A young woman's lifeless body was lying there, completely covered in blood. The van was nowhere to be seen. I told the officers everything that had happened. The van, the man's voice, and the girls talking about drinking blood. They said they would investigate and kindly drove me home since I was too shaken to walk in the mall. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. While looking out the window, I suddenly noticed something that made my stomach drop. The same van was slowly driving down my street again, with its headlights turned off. This time I quickly wrote down the license plate number and called the police immediately. When officers arrived, the van had already disappeared. But what they told me afterward was even more disturbing. They checked the license plate. It was registered in South Dakota. However, other police departments across the country had reported seeing a suspicious van with the exact same plate that very night. One in Vermont, another in Nevada, one in Alaska, and even one in Texas. The officer told me they would contact me if they learned anything more, but they never called again. I'm not someone who believes much in the paranormal. My best guess is that it was some kind of cult using fake license plates while committing crimes across different states. But honestly, I may never know the truth. After that incident, I moved away from Indiana. And now, whenever I see something suspicious, I don't hesitate. I leave immediately. One evening after work, my wife and I decided to go out for dinner instead of cooking at home. We returned around 9 p.m. Since we both had work the next day, we usually didn't stay up too late. By 9:30, we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for bed. Around 10 o'clock, we were already lying in bed. Normally, we turn the lights off at about 11 o'clock, and during that hour, we either read or watch an episode of a show together. That night, we were watching our show when suddenly the phone rang. Gianna immediately said, "Don't answer it. Anyone calling this late probably isn't bringing good news." I understood her point, but I thought the opposite. If someone was calling this late, it might actually be an emergency. So I leaned over to grab the landline next to the bed. Before I could even lift the receiver, the ringing stopped. The old landline we had wasn't very reliable. Once a call ended, the caller ID disappeared and there was no call history to check. I assumed it was probably just a wrong number. But a few minutes later, the phone started ringing again. This time I picked it up and looked at the display. It said unknown number. Both Gianna and I thought that was strange, especially after 10 p.m. In my opinion, there's an unspoken rule that people usually don't call after 9 o'clock at night unless it's important. I hesitated and didn't answer. But as soon as the ringing stopped, the phone began ringing again. At that point it felt urgent. like maybe something had happened to a family member. So I quickly answered the call. On the other end, I heard the voice of my neighbor. "Oh," he asked, "do you know that man standing in front of your house?" I was confused. "What are you talking about?" He simply told me to go outside and check, then abruptly hung up. The sudden hang-up felt extremely strange. When I told Gianna what he said, the look on her face immediately turned to fear. "Don't go outside," she said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'll just look through the window." I went downstairs and slightly moved the curtain to look out at the front yard. There was no one there. Just to be sure, I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. I looked around the yard and even checked the bushes near the walkway. No one. At that point, I felt slightly annoyed. It crossed my mind that maybe O was playing some kind of prank, though it didn't really seem like something he would normally do. I went back upstairs and told Gianna that nobody was outside. We both felt confused because it just didn't seem like something O would do. She suggested calling him back, so I did. The phone rang but went straight to voicemail. I left a message saying, "Hey O, what was that about? Give me a call back." Only seconds later, the phone rang again. The caller ID once again said unknown caller. I answered. It was O's voice again, and before I could even speak, he said calmly, "Go outside. There's someone standing in front of your house." His tone was slow and oddly calm. Then he hung up. Now I was seriously unsettled. What the hell is going on? I said out loud. I told Gianna to stay upstairs while I went down again to check. I returned to the front window and carefully looked through the curtain. This time I saw someone. A man was standing at the end of our walkway where it met the sidewalk. He was wearing a hood pulled low over his head, hiding his face completely in shadow. My heart started racing. I opened the door slightly and called out, "Can I help you?" The man didn't move. He just stood there silently. I warned him that I would call the police. Just then the house phone started ringing again. I quickly shut the door and walked into the kitchen where the other phone was. This time the caller ID showed O's actual number. I answered. O spoke in a normal voice and said, "Hey, I just heard your voicemail. What's going on?" I was completely confused. "What do you mean? You just called me twice telling me there was a guy outside my house." He sounded just as confused as I was. "I didn't call you," he insisted. A moment later, he said he couldn't see anyone outside my house from where he was. I rushed back to the window and looked outside again. The man who had been standing there was gone. I demanded O tell me immediately if this was some kind of prank. If it was, and he kept lying about it, we were going to have a serious problem. But O swore he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't the type to play childish pranks anyway. He was always quiet and respectful. To make sure I wasn't losing my mind, I put the phone on speaker so Gianna could confirm that someone with O's voice had called us twice. O did the same thing and brought his wife onto the call so she could